Hello students, this is Mr. Root here. Today our lesson is going to focus on the sums and differences of rational and irrational numbers. At the end of this lesson, students will be able to identify when the sums and differences of rational and irrationals are going to be rational or irrational. So first of all, we got to kind of think, hey, how do I know if it's rational or irrational? Well, we know rational numbers can be put in the form of fractions and decimals, but we also know that some square roots are irrational. So let's take a look at this first problem. Is the square root of 16/49 rational or irrational? Well, first of all, you can I always like to use the calculator. So I'm going to take out my calculator, press on, alright, and I'm just going to type square root of 16/49 into the calculator. Now the square root button is right above the squared. It's this little yellow part, so I know that I have to press the yellow second, and then that. And then I'm taking the square root of 16/49, and I know a fraction is the same as dividing. Alright, since the whole fraction is inside the square root, I want the whole fraction part inside the square root, so I'm going to close off my parentheses there, and I'm going to hit enter. Now, just looking at this number, this looks irrational to me. But, whoops, and it's because it says 0.571 blah blah blah. It's a lot of stuff. So let's go back to the calculator. But maybe it repeats, and here's how you can check. Alright? If it's rational, we can change this into a fraction. So to change whatever your answer is into a fraction, you just press math. Right? And then fraction is number 1, so you can either just press 1, or you can scroll to where you want it, and then you hit enter. I want to see my answer as a fraction. Now if it's rational, it'll change to a fraction. But if it's irrational, it'll just give you the same decimal answer. So in this case, this problem is rational because I can represent this as a fraction. All right? So I know my answer is not going to be this long decimal. It actually is 4/7. So we can always check to see if our answers are rational or irrational with the calculator. So in this case, it is rational. Now today we're going to talk about the sums and differences of rational numbers. So there's a few rules that you're going to want to write down to remember. And here they are. The sum or difference, and this plus minus means adding or subtracting. When you add or subtract two rational numbers, your answer is going to be rational. When you add or subtract a rational and an irrational, the sum or difference will be irrational. Irrational and rational, you just flip them around. It's still adding or subtracting, so it's going to be irrational. And the adding or subtracting of two irrational numbers will be irrational. So basically the only time you're going to get a rational answer is if you're adding or subtracting two rational numbers. All right? If there's any type of irrational in there, your answer is going to be irrational. So let's take a look at a few examples here. Alright, so for all of these, we need to perform the operation and label our answer as either rational or irrational. Alright, so right away I'm looking at number 1, and I see 4/13 plus 1 8/10. Alright, just looking at this right away, I know that since this is a fraction, it's rational. Plus, I'm adding this decimal, which is also rational. And I know from the chart from last slide, rational plus irrational is going to equal irrational. All right? But you should always double check. So I'm going to go down, grab my calculator. All right? I'm going to clear out that last stuff. Now I'm doing 4/3 and fraction bars just like divide. So I'm going to take 4 divided by 13, and then I'm going to add them together to 1.8. And when you add them together, we get this crazy number. Now, this doesn't look rational to me, but let's just double check. All right, I'm going to just hit math, hit fraction, go to 1, hit enter. Oh, and this actually turns out to be a fraction. So I've got my rational number here. It turns out it doesn't look like a rational number, but I can always check with the calculator. All right, so let's go back now to number 2. We got number 2. 2, which I know is a rational number, plus pi. Now everybody at this point should know pi is irrational. From our slide, I know a rational plus an irrational is going to equal an irrational. All right. Okay. Now let's just double check. Ooh, and I forgot to write down my answer for number 1. When I add these together, I did it on my calculator. Always show your work, so we got to write down what we did in the calculator. 4/13 plus 1.8. Oops. And I know my final answer was 137/65. Which is a rational number. So that's our answer for number 1. Now number 2, I've got a rational plus an irrational. Let's just double check to make sure it's irrational. Take out your calculator. We got number 2 now. So it's 2 plus, and pi is in yellow above this button right here, so I'm going to press second pi and then hit enter. All right, so I've got this 4.14159265. All right, it looks irrational, but let's just double check. Go to math. Let's see if we can make this a fraction. Hit enter. It stays a decimal. So when we change it to fraction mode, it can't be put into a fraction because it's not a rational number. So I know my answer is going to be 5.14159, blah, blah, blah. It keeps going because it's irrational. And I'm going to say it's irrational. All right. Oh, and I forgot to show work, but it's just 2 plus pi. All right. Now take a look at number 3. I've got 11/7 minus the square root of 841. Now, right off this, I know this is a rational number, but I don't know about the square root of 841. So I'm going to type this in my calculator. I'm going to do 11/7. This is number 3. 11/7, and I'm going to minus the square root of 841. Try it out on the calculator. I'm going to put my fraction in parentheses. And I'm going to minus the square root, again it's yellow, of 841. Now that's the only thing I'm going to square root, so I'm going to close off those parentheses, and I'm going to hit enter. Ooh, again this nasty number, negative, blah, 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 blah. All right, let's check it out. Is it rational or irrational? Right now it looks irrational, but it turns out this is actually a fraction. So I can write my final answer when I do this is negative 192/7, which is rational. So if my final answer was rational, this must have been a rational number too. So it must have been rational minus irrational. Alright, so I've got 7, next one, I've got 7 square root of 2 minus 3 square root of 2. Again, some square roots are rational, some of them are not. I'm not sure what this one is. Alright, so I'm going to just do it in my calculator. And I'm going to go 7, and since it's right next to it, I can just do right next to it, which means times minus 3 square root of 2. I don't know if these are rational or irrational, so let's just try it out. So I've got 7 times the square root, and I can just put it next to it, of 2. And I only want to take the square root of 2, so I got to close off my parentheses up top. Minus 3 times the square root of 2. And again, I only want the square root of 2. Close off your parentheses. Hit enter. 5.656. Alright, again, looks irrational, but let's just double check. Oh, and it is irrational. So we're going to say that this equals about 5.65, blah, 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 which is irrational. Right? And if you wanted more of an exact answer, these actually both have the square root, so you can kind of treat them like variables. 7x minus 3x would be 4x. So 7 square root of 2 minus 3 square root of 2 turns out to be 4 square root of 2, which is equal to 5.65, blah, 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 blah. Again, an irrational number. Right? So you're adding or subtracting, just take a look at what you start out with. Right? And then if you're ever not sure, you can always double check on the calculator, hit the math button, and then fraction after you get an answer. For your summary, you're going to answer the 4 FLEC questions. First, what was the focus? So here's some sentence starters. Today's focus was, you finish it off. One thing I learned blah, blah, blah. All right. You finish those off. So you do need complete sentences. Here's your sentence starters. You need an example of what we learned. All right. And then any question that you still have. If you continue to have those questions, make sure you're asking your classmates or your teacher to help clarify those questions.